Vegas, it is a big time deal here on 1140 The Bet and Audacy Sports. Joining us is Jemele Hill, contributor writer for The Atlantic, got her own podcast on Spotify called Unbothered, and her new book, which is right here, Uphill, the memoir, is available wherever books are sold. And Jemele, we've been doing this thing all year. Going to therapy. I've learned we got to give flowers, and there's 3 weeks left in the year, so we're going to do it now. So, number one, thank you for all the content that you've created all throughout your career that I've digested, and also thank you for being someone to remind me that with this microphone and these platforms that we are to stand for something. But as we start, I need to know, this Gabrielle Union clip resurfaced. Has DJ Vlad or Lil Boosie Goons tried to come up to you in public?
No, that has not happened. And yeah, it was just kind of amusing to me because we did that interview so long ago. It was when Gab was on her book tour promoting her second memoir. And so she asked me to do a moderated conversation with her, which I did. And the full context of the clip, I believe it's on my YouTube page, of where I asked her just about how her and her husband Dwayne Wade, as people know, uh, what it's like for them in a world where you have, what the suicide rates look like for trans youth, what they look like in terms of just having suicidal thoughts, the depression, all the mental health issues that are impacting the youth in this community, and how her and Dwayne have tried to form a wall around Zaya so that she can feel emotionally safe. And that becomes much harder to do when somebody like Boosie just out of nowhere starts to criticize their parenting, their family, Zaya, and in a way that I thought was just very distasteful, disrespectful, and transphobic. And she hadn't said anything. She had not responded to the attacks in any way. Some of which were about her as a person, Dwayne as a person. Like, they didn't respond, and people have to understand, especially it comes to your kids, is that's a different layer of protectiveness that people are going to have, understandably so. And that was one of the rare, if not maybe the only time she's ever directly responded to him, despite the number of times that he has attacked her, Zaya, and their family. So yeah, that, I mean, at some point you get tired.
You
And
gotta
so
let
I
that
think,
chopper fly one time. Just one time it
hey,
has to happen.
she was like, I got time today. So it kind of is what it is. So yeah, that the resurfacing of the clip, I don't really know why that was the case. Maybe somebody came across it on YouTube, but she was definitely justified in finally responding to someone who had been attacking her family.
And let's go straight into this book, and we'll branch off from there. And like a lot of times I think of when people are writing a book that it's kind of like therapy for them, or it's therapeutic, getting to write this out. But for you, and so many things that have happened in your life, and you talking in detail about your mother, your father, and just everything that's gone on in your family, was there ever any hesitation for you to like let the world know that these things actually happened, or for like your family being like, hey, cat's out of the bag, like everyone's going to know this about us?
No, there was no hesitation on my part, because I felt like the only way that the memoir could be received in the way it has been received, positively, with people really getting to learn um, not just a different side to me, but different sides, if you will, more than one side. The only way for people to really truly understand that, to me, would be if I was as open and as honest as I possibly could be. And, my mother, who's a central piece of this book, and her struggles with addiction, and her being the survival of intense sexual abuse, I think she was more than fine with me sharing the story, because I had to live it with her. So it's my story too. Her story is my story, because, because she raised me. And she always wanted me to have the room to tell my story in the way that I felt like was best. So she was not in any way surprised or shocked by anything. She read it, well before it actually hit the bookshelf. So she knew everything that was in it. And I think she was looking forward to it, in the sense it was an opportunity for her to also have her own testimony within that. So it really wasn't any hesitation On my part, I mean, you, of course, there's a part of you that naturally, as a human being, you wonder how people would receive that. But I wasn't worried because I felt like it came from such a raw place of truth and honesty that it just kind of is what it is. And people, how they respond to it is how they respond to it.
And another thing that I can imagine during the process of writing this book is kind of reconnecting with your family to just even to the point of like, hey, let me make sure I got these details right for some of these stories. Like, is that something that's important to you now? Because, like, for me, to be honest, I'm out here in Vegas. All my family's in the East Coast. And it's one of the things that, like, I struggle with. Like, I need to listen to this podcast so I know this stat. So instead of calling my uncle or aunt or whatever, like, how important is it for you to like reconnect and touch base with your family?
The accuracy of it was really important. And, my mother and I, we went through several interviews together because my mother knows so much of the family history. So using her was easy. And then there were friends of mine that I reached out to too, especially when I was telling the ESPN part of the story. Like Michael Smith and I had a long conversation because I was just wanted to make sure. I was like, am I remembering this right? But this is how that happened, correct? And so yeah, I mean, as a journalist, like you want to make sure that you get everything right. And so that was very important to me, is that I not misremember something, misrepresent something. I wanted to make sure I had the context correct. Still my perspective, but important to get, the context of what I was writing about correct.
And I know that like a big theme of this book, and what you talk a lot about is breaking through that generational trauma. And it's something that a lot of people are dealing with. And even like on a separate note, I kind of connected with it because my baby boy's right there. He's 4 years old. And like me and his mom get into conversations because I don't give him enough grace. If I see him do one thing right the first time, I'm like, oh, he got it. And that's not how a 4-year-old works. And she's always like, yo, you are reparenting yourself. You're not your dad, and how you were raised, and you can't do that to him. So I guess my question to you is like, what's the biggest thing? Because obviously there's a lot of things that have to go into breaking that, but what's the biggest thing to you in breaking generational trauma and going through those barriers?
Well, I think what was really key and important in terms of us breaking that was the fact that my mother was always very honest and transparent about the demons she was fighting against. My mother never made her drug use look cool. She never made it look appealing, none of that. And so she would often parent from the perspective of do as I say, not as I do. And maybe to some people that seems like a flawed, a flawed technique as a parent, but you'd be shocked how well it does work, just in the sense of like, especially if your parents aren't encouraging you to follow the same path. My mother never encouraged me to follow her same path. She always told me I deserved and had a right to better than whatever situations and circumstances we were living in. She always set a standard, the standard being, okay, regardless of what's going on with me, I still expect you to go to school, get good grades, be responsible, do all these things. And so she was actually quite strict on me. And so that was why I think one reason I was able to that like that trauma kind of was breaking up. She also was very aware of what the issues were with her and my grandmother, and she didn't want to repeat those same mistakes. So it really what happens is there's got to be a lot of intentionality. And a therapist told my mother and I this when we did Red Table Talk with Jada Pinkett Smith and Gammy and Willow, and she was right. She was like, a lot of times I think parents feel like their children are supposed to be here, like when they get here, that they have their blank canvas in terms of a personality and that you give them their personality. And while your kids, from an environmental standpoint, they may pick up certain things that you do, but they come here with their own distinct personalities that have nothing to do with you. And you have to allow room for wherever their personality is for you to support, grow it. So yes, it might take your son more than one time doing it right to understand how to do it. Whereas maybe you were the kid who, as soon as you did it right once, you did it right forever. But
Yeah.
yes, that's where I think maybe the grace, that's where that factors in, because you have to allow them kind of room to figure out who they are independent of who you are.
No, 100%. I guess baby mama was right. She's always right though, right? She's always right. And earlier when I was giving you your flowers and I said, standing for something, one of the things that I admire most about you is like your ability now that like you've grown so much and you're in so many different circles is like you've maintained who you are. throughout wherever you're at or whatever topic you're talking about, sports or otherwise. Like, to you, what's the biggest thing in maintaining that? Because that's a very difficult thing to do.
Well, I think it's the mentality that I have, which is I got into the business of journalism because I wanted to tell stories, and um, I believed in that principle that the journalists are the watchdogs of society. So the method is always going to change and be different. You know, one minute it might be podcasting, the next minute it might be radio, another minute it might be through TV and film, or through, say, traditional media outlets like the Atlantic. As long as I was comfortable with the type of platforms shifting and the method of delivery, the essence of what I do was never going to change. You know, finding a good story, telling a good story, getting people to tell you things that they don't tell other people, getting to the heart and the root of who somebody is. That is all of the principles that are just basics in journalism. And they transfer to so many different spaces. So, one thing, even though I may be being the executive producer of Colin Kaepernick's documentary over here, and then have my work with the Atlantic over there, even though they're different mediums and it's different methods, I'm still doing the same work because I'm still trying to get to the bottom of a truth. And I'm in all of the things that I do, there's a certain synergy there where it kind of all boils back down to the same thing of telling good and compelling stories.
And I kind of want to ask you this: when it comes to you sending out the tweets of the most obvious thing in the world about our former president, was that kind of one of the first moments where you realized like the scope of your words and like how much they can mean, where like this broke through? This is different from you going on His and Hers and saying, hey, the Celtics aren't going to be good this year. Like, this was a different thing, and like the whole world was paying attention to it. Was that one of the first moments like, oh snap, my words are very powerful?
Yeah, it definitely the reach of that. Never did I expect when I tweeted that those tweets would go all the way to the White House. And um, I think a lot of it, maybe the surprise for people was that it was coming from an ESPN Sports Center anchor. It wasn't coming from maybe some of your usual echo chambers, CNN, MSNBC, the political stratosphere overall. So you had somebody completely who was not in politics saying this about the president, and on a network that, despite all the false narratives, is not known for politics. So I think all of that had a lot to do with how the reaction landed, in addition to the fact that once it's brought up in a White House press briefing, it's going to take on a life of its own. So it was really a huge snowball effect that I could never, ever have predicted. And I was a little surprised about it myself. Like, why would the president of the United States care what a Sports Center anchor thinks about them?
That man was
Uh,
bored.
yeah, but he also was, as we, when he was on social media, when he was on Twitter in particular, he was very much the kind of person who would probably put his name in the search engine and see what came up. Like, he was definitely Googling himself and watching everything said about him. So he cared that much about what people thought about him, and, which only lends to his petulancy, because you would think the president did not have that kind of time, but apparently he did. So once he and his press secretary kind of really brought those tweets to a super national, I'd say an international space. That became sort of a life changing moment for me.
What was the biggest adjustment with like the newfound fame that came with that, for better or
The,
worse? And
the biggest adjustment was definitely the security concerns, because I was, of course, I knew that people knew who I was before this tweet happened, but because they knew who I was in mostly a sports capacity, it was a lot different. And that's not to say that I didn't get my share of like racist hate mail or those kind of things just doing sports, because I did,
yeah.
but that quadrupled after the Trump stuff, and it was threats on my life and all that kind of thing. And so suddenly when I'm out in public spaces, I have to think about security, something I didn't have to think about before, and really be much more aware and cognizant, and had to live a part of my life that was really hidden, that I wasn't used to hiding before. And so, yeah, like that was definitely the biggest adjustment for me.
And one thing I do want to ask you is I've been freaking out today for two reasons. Number one, tomorrow is the 20-year anniversary of Around the Horn. And then also, I don't know if it's
Hmm.
today or tomorrow, but LeBron's son and Melo's son are playing on ESPN in high
Yeah.
school. And I was like, bro, I'm from Cleveland. Like, I was like, we were doing this when I was 9 years old. Now I'm almost 30 with a kid, and all this is changing. But with Around the Horn specifically, like, you go back to 2002, 2003, 2004, like ESPN, the era changed where, journalists, columnists were just on the sports reporters, but now they were being brought into the shows, and we're doing PTI and cold pizza and all this stuff. And you kind of were ushered in with a whole bunch of other people. And now we're in this, whatever you want to call it, like debate television, running ESPN and being popular. Like, for better or worse, how do you see how things have changed, and what do you think of that and the landscape, I guess?
Well, one of the bigger changes I've noticed since then, because I got to ESPN in 2006. So those shows are really, really starting to gain traction. And as you just mentioned, the entire debate format was really starting to take off because there were a ton of debate shows that were there when I got to ESPN and were created in my first 5 6 years at the network. You had Jim Rome is Burning, you had Outside the Lines, which there was a commentary portion of that. Obviously, you had Around the Horn and PTI, and then Cold Pizza went to First Take and then became an all debate format. You had Sports Nation, Lebertard show, our show. So it was a certain era that of those kind of debate shows that was really kind of at the forefront. And what it did was it ushered in strongly this idea of the celebrity journalist. And when I first got to ESPN, and I often remind people that they hired me to be a columnist for ESPN.com, I was not hired to be on television. And television eventually became my full time job at ESPN. But when I got there, there was a very distinct line between print and broadcast. Print journalists did not want to be on TV really. Like some of them were cutting through for sure. You had Stephen A. Smith, you had, a number of other journalists, Michael Wilbon, who were cutting through on the television side, Tony Kornheiser, but that wasn't the primary thought of most print
Wasn't
journalists.
it looked wasn't it looked down upon, like
Oh, it
doing that
totally
stuff?
was. Yeah, it was frowned upon. Like it was considered silly. It was not considered serious. As it was, a lot of sports reporters were kind of, pissed because they used to refer to the sports department as the toy department. Like when you don't, they're serious journalists aren't in sports. And that started to change. And so now, I mean, fast forward maybe around like 2012, 13, 14, somewhere in that range. And suddenly all the younger journalists who were coming up to me were asking me how they could have television careers and they were in print. And I was like, this is wild because they actually think they can make money and be famous at this because they see a few of us who have been able to have some, really high profile positions at ESPN. So that was the most significant change. And now when you talk to most younger journalists, they're interested in multiple mediums and not just one in particular. So I think the days of the utility journalists are here. And that's, they come in expecting to be able to host a podcast, host a radio show, do TV, and write all at the same time.
Radio's the same thing. There's people who still think they could come in, do their show for 2 hours, and leave. I'm like, bro, you better have this on video. You better have a
Yeah.
podcast. You better be on social media. You better understand TikTok. You don't got to dance, but you better understand. One thing I do want to ask you, and before we let you go, we'll do some quick questions before we get you out of here. I was lucky enough that at the station that I'm here in Vegas, like no one wanted to cover the Aces, and I
Mm.
have a philosophy of wherever you're at, get in the building and you'll figure stuff out. So I was like, so no one goes there to cover the team? Cool, I'll do that. I got my little communications degree. I don't know the ins and outs. I don't consider myself a journalist, but I went in there and I was fortunate enough. Number one, they won the championship in my first year. That was nuts. But am I wrong in feeling a little upset that I had a couple moments with Asia Wilson in post-game press conferences that picked up traction, and that went viral on ESPN posted and Bleacher Report, and they didn't tag me? Do I need to get
Mm.
myself straight? And like, it's not about the credit. Once you ask that question, it's for the rest of the world and it's not yours.
Well, if you're in a press conference setting, it's kind of tough because, these are just where questions from any outlet are asked, and of course they show the answer. They don't necessarily show who asked it or give credit to the person that asked it unless it was somebody within their network. So it is tough, but I'm of the belief that regardless of how big you are as an outlet, especially if you sort of took something that was asked by someone who's local, I think it's important to try to go out of your way to give that person credit for doing it. All that being said, though, I mean, you certainly can give the credit to yourself, and you certainly know that you are the one who asked the question. And just if you repost it or share it, make sure that you have your name on it so that people understand this is where it originated from. But yeah, in our business, unfortunately, in a lot of those viral moments that happen in press conferences or media scrums, it's not as easy for the person who actually asked the question that may have touched off a conversation or a certain reaction on social media to get the credit that they deserve.
It might not be much of a surprise to you, but I'm a huge Le Batard fan and listen to the show a lot. I remember when they did the 24-hour show and you and Michael Smith joined. One of the biggest flexes that I still remember in my head is when John Skipper went on. You said, "John, thank you. You were the first person to give me $1 million check." I ain't trying to ask you about your bank account, but I do want to know, what was your favorite purchase from that check?
Oh, my favorite purchase, that's pretty easy, is I bought my mother a Benz. That was by far my favorite purchase because, I've seen it throughout the years so many times. You have athletes, they get to a certain point where they've landed the big contract or just got drafted. First thing they do is buy mama a house or daddy a house or mama and daddy a house and a car, and the elation that they feel because they know that what their parents have sacrificed to get them to that point, and even though they're not asking to be paid back, it feels good to be able to do something for, someone who invested so much in you. So for me, my mother, she'd had a Benz before, but it was older at that point. I think her Benz was like 15 years old.
We
Easy. And
upgraded a
so
little bit.
she got an upgrade. She got a big time upgrade. And, the look on her face, the excitement, the elation. I posted the clip on social media and it got like hundreds of thousands of views. And that was a really big moment for me to be able to do that for her.
Update. First off, we love to see it. I'm going to do it again. Congratulations. Yes, yes, yes. Any update on the Colin Kaepernick documentary?
Well, we're in production and, putting things together. Everything's going well. I think it's going to be extremely powerful. And I think so much of his story eh, was told so wrong, and the narrative was so untrue that a lot of people who were anti Colin Kaepernick will be embarrassed by how they felt when they see all of this put together. And it's been a really long time since we've heard from him personally, and he's very powerful and compelling in it. And so I'm just looking forward to Colin getting the opportunity to tell his story his way, and me being able to help in the smallest regards to that, and being able to facilitate that is really very meaningful for me in my career.
And our last question, whether it was a good story or a bad story, what was the biggest story of the year?
Oh man, this year,
If you want to
God.
stick to sports, but if you want to take it out, it don't matter. Whatever you choose.
Oh my gosh. It's such a difficult question to answer because it feels like every other day the biggest story in the world is happening. I mean, I think definitely if I just like limit it to sports, Brittany Griner's detainment and her release to me would easily be in the top three, and it's not three, because I don't think anybody had on the bingo card an American athlete would be wrongfully detained in Russia, held captive for as long as she is, and then released in the same year. Because I think, understandably so, for a lot of people, that looked like a very dismal situation. And we didn't know how long Brittany was going to be detained, if she would have wound up having to do this full 9-year sentence she was originally
Mm.
given, to see her railroaded that way. And then what I think is kind of worse is that the fact that there wasn't overwhelming joy about her return was just really
Not
disheartening
even
to
for an
see.
hour. Not even for an
Right.
hour.
Yeah. I mean, that was just really disheartening because anytime you can get an American out of a Russian prison, it should be celebrated. And so I'm just, ecstatic for her and her family that she's home. And I just read already that she's played basketball already, just to kind of figure out where she's at. And I think what will be one of the biggest moments in sports is the day she takes the court again. That's going to be a huge and tremendous moment.
No, 100%. And Jemele, thank you again for everything that you do. Thank you for this book you got me to read. For those watching on YouTube, Jemele Hill, Uphill, a memoir, available. Get it for Christmas and the holidays. Jemele, thank you so much for the time.
I appreciate you. Thank you and take care and much success.